A tanker captain in the Gulf of Oman got the order to turn back before a single missile had been fired anywhere near his ship. No Navy contacted him. No Coast Guard raised an alarm. The call came from an insurance underwriter in London, telling his company that the policy covering the vessel, the cargo, the crew, the hull itself, no longer existed. Nothing had physically changed in the water around him, but somewhere in a spreadsheet in the city of London, his voyage had already become impossible. That is how the Strait of Hormuz closed in 2026. Not with a mine, not with a blockade, with a phone call. For decades, the Strait of Hormuz has functioned less like a border and more like a valve. Roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas funnels through a channel barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, squeezed between Iran and Oman. Refineries across Asia are built around the assumption that this one stretch of water will keep functioning, war or no war. China draws a significant share of its crude through it. South Korea and Japan depend on it almost entirely for the oil that keeps their industrial economies running. Iran had threatened to close it more times than most analysts bothered counting. After sanctions, after ship seizures, after almost every regional flare-up for 40 years. And every time, the world absorbed the rhetoric and moved on. The Strait had a reputation, dangerous in theory, reliable in practice. That reputation ended on February 28, 2026. On that day, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran, targeting military and nuclear infrastructure. Not shipping, not the strait itself. And yet within about 48 hours, tanker traffic through Hormuz had collapsed. Not because Iran had physically blocked the route yet, but because the global insurance market had already decided the risk could no longer be calculated. This is the detail that gets lost in coverage of the missiles. The shutdown of Hormuz didn't begin with a weapon. It began with paperwork. War risk premiums, the surcharge insurers apply to cover a ship against acts of war, jumped roughly fivefold within 2 days of the strikes. Several major marine insurers didn't just raise prices. They canceled existing coverage outright and quoted replacements at somewhere near 60 times pre-war rates. Lloyd's Joint War Committee, the body that formally designates which waters count as conflict zones for insurance purposes, redrew its map and folded the entire Arabian Gulf into that designation. A shipowner without valid war risk cover cannot legally sail a chartered vessel with someone else's cargo and a crew's lives aboard, into a declared war zone. So they didn't. What makes this worth sitting with is what it reveals about how modern choke points actually get closed. In the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, tankers in these same waters endured years of direct attacks. Hundreds of ships hit, hundreds of sailors killed, and traffic never fully stopped. The insurance system of that era was less concentrated and more willing to absorb losses, and today's bypass pipelines didn't exist yet. For decades later, the mechanism is different. Marine insurance, war risk cover, and reinsurance now run through a small number of tightly interlocked underwriting hubs, calibrated to withdraw coverage the moment a risk becomes hard to model, rather than simply expensive. A handful of verified attacks, publicized quickly, can now freeze a market that years of sustained combat once failed to freeze. The weapon, in other words, isn't the mine. It's the coupling between insurance markets and maritime law, a system engineered for stability that turns out to be extraordinarily sensitive to disruption. The same pattern had already shown up further south, in the Red Sea, where Houthi attacks on shipping never physically closed the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, but pushed war risk premiums up enough that most operators simply stopped using it. Hormuz was the same mechanism, at a scale the global economy could not shrug off. Only after the commercial shutdown did the physical blockade catch up to it. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy began boarding and attacking merchant ships. Sea mines went into the water. In numbers Iran itself reportedly struggled to track, which later complicated its own promises to reopen the route safely. By late March, Brent crude had jumped to its highest level in years, and the month recorded the largest single monthly increase in oil prices on record. In April, with talks stalled, the United States escalated further. President Trump ordered a naval blockade of Iranian ports, and by the following month American forces had turned away more than 100 vessels attempting to trade with Iran directly. Two blockades were now operating in the same stretch of water at the same time, one Iranian, one American, each claiming to be defensive, each making the other's claim to have reopened the strait meaningless. The waterway that the world had quietly assumed would always function had, within 2 months, become the site of what analysts would later call the largest oil supply shock in decades. From there, the disruption stopped being a shipping story and became a structural one. Producers with infrastructure that bypasses the strait held onto their exports. Saudi Arabia routed crude overland toward the Red Sea. Oman, sitting on the open ocean side of the choke point, never needed a workaround at all. The UAE pushed a share of its output through the Habshan to Fujairah pipeline, landing barrels in the Gulf of Oman without ever touching the contested channel. Everyone without that kind of workaround simply lost revenue, even as the price of oil climbed around them, because they had oil to sell and no safe way to move it. Meanwhile, producers with no exposure to Hormuz at all came out ahead. American exporters saw tens of billions of dollars in additional revenue. Russian oil and gas, including a wave of liquefied natural gas shipped from the Yamal project in the Arctic, filled gaps in European supply that Gulf shipments could no longer reliably fill. European buyers who had spent years trying to wean themselves off Russian energy after the invasion of Ukraine found themselves quietly increasing those same imports because the alternative was rationing. A war fought over Iran's nuclear program ended up rerouting global energy revenue toward two countries with almost no direct stake in the fighting. The distortion didn't stop at oil. Container shipping, the system that moves everything from electronics to clothing to furniture, got pulled into the same vortex. Major carriers began diverting Asia to Europe and Asia to US routes around the Cape of Good Hope, adding roughly 2 weeks and thousands of nautical miles to voyages that used to pass through the Suez Corridor and the wider Gulf region. Spot freight rates on some of the busiest lanes rose by anywhere from half to 3/4 compared with pre-crisis levels. None of that shows up in a headline about Iran. It shows up months later in a shipping invoice, in a retailer's cost of goods, in a price tag that went up for reasons that have nothing to do with the product inside the box. Governments began stepping into roles usually left to private markets. When commercial insurers pulled back from the strait almost entirely, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, an agency built to support development projects in emerging markets, not to underwrite war zone shipping, stood up a reinsurance facility worth up to $40 billion, partnering with major insurers to backstop coverage for hull damage, cargo loss, and liability. A development bank repurposed overnight to keep a global energy artery breathing. It is one of the clearer signs of where this crisis actually sits. Not in the realm of diplomacy, but in the realm of who is willing to absorb a loss that private capital has decided it can no longer price. But a reinsurance facility doesn't move a single ship. And months later, with a ceasefire signed and both governments insisting the crisis is over, the strait still isn't behaving like a waterway at peace. For the people whose lives don't show up in a barrel price, the consequences were more immediate. Japanese refiners, who draw the overwhelming majority of their crude from Gulf producers and move most of it through Hormuz, asked their government to release strategic stockpiles just to keep operations steady. Pakistan, unable to secure normal shipments, arranged an emergency reroute of Saudi crude through the Red Sea port of Yanbu, a detour of thousands of extra miles, an extra cost that eventually lands on someone's fuel bill. More than 600 vessels, over half of them oil tankers, sat anchored in the Gulf for weeks with nowhere to go, crews suspended between a war they had no part in and a market that had simply stopped covering their risk. Some of those crews spent months aboard ships that weren't moving, watching fuel and food supplies dwindle while lawyers and underwriters somewhere else argued over paperwork. In one brief window in April, when both Washington and Tehran simultaneously claimed the strait was open, 6 cruise ships took the opportunity to sail through and resume their schedules elsewhere. A small, strange detail that captures just how conditional open had become. It wasn't a policy. It was a gap in the crossfire that 6 ships happened to notice in time. Here is the part that complicates the tidy story of a war that closes a strait and a ceasefire that reopens it. A ceasefire has technically existed for months. Iran and the United States signed an agreement in June to end the fighting and lift the blockade. And the strait, by any normal definition, is still not functioning as it did before. Within days of that agreement, Iran said it had closed the strait again, citing Israeli strikes elsewhere in the region as a violation of the deal, a claim the U.S. denied, even as its own commercial traffic data showed no meaningful increase in ships moving through. Iran's navy went further, redefining Hormuz itself. No longer the narrow channel most maps show, but what one Iranian official called a vast operational area stretching from the port of Jas to Siri Island, hundreds of miles of coastline reframed as a zone Iran considers its own to control. As of early July, roughly 1 in 3 of the ships that used to pass through Hormuz on an average day are doing so now, a fraction of prior volume. Scattered across mine avoidance routes Iran has drawn onto its own charts, restricted lanes hugging its coastline, and a narrower southern corridor coordinated with the U.S. Navy along Oman's side. Iran has floated the idea of charging a toll for safe passage, comparing it to the fee Turkey collects from ships crossing the Bosphorus. The comparison sounds reasonable until you remember that most of Hormuz's usable channel runs through Omani territorial waters, not Iranian ones. And Oman, bound by international maritime law, is obligated to keep transit open regardless of who wants to charge for it. That fact nearly triggered a separate crisis of its own. When Oman, acting as the primary back-channel mediator between Washington and Tehran, resisted pressure to fall in line with U.S. positioning, Trump threatened it directly in a cabinet meeting, and the Treasury simultaneously floated sanctions, an extraordinary threat against the one country that had spent months quietly trying to keep the talks alive. The confrontation was walked back within a day, but it illustrated something important. Even the mediators trying to de-escalate this crisis have found themselves inside the blast radius of it. Reopening the physical strait, it turns out, was never the same problem as reopening trade through it. Insurers, once burned, don't return to a market the moment the shooting stops. They want a track record, weeks, sometimes months, without a new incident, before premiums start easing off the multiples they reached at the height of the crisis. Even now, with a ceasefire nominally in place, war risk cover for a Hormuz transit still prices far above pre-war levels, and several protection and indemnity clubs, the insurers who cover a shipowner's liability rather than the vessel itself, have simply declined to offer cover at all. A tanker owner today can hold a legal green light from 2 governments and still be unable to find anyone willing to underwrite the voyage. Peace, in this sense, is necessary but not sufficient. The market needs to believe in the peace before it will price around it. And belief, unlike a ceasefire, cannot be signed into existence at a table in Doha. Put the pieces together, and the picture that emerges isn't really about Iran, or Israel, or even oil. It's about how fragile a single financial mechanism, the pricing of risk, has become as the connective tissue of global trade. The Strait of Hormuz didn't close because a physical barrier appeared in the water. It closed because a market decided, almost overnight, that the water could no longer be priced. And it hasn't reopened, not because the mines are all gone or the guns have gone quiet, but because that same market hasn't decided the water is safe to price again. Ceasefires are signed by governments. Insurance is underwritten by people reading lost data, and lost data takes months to accumulate. In a very real sense, the strait is being held not by a navy, but by an actuarial table, and no communique from Washington or Tehran can shortcut that math. And this isn't unique to Hormuz. The same 3 conditions, a narrow passage, no easy alternative route, and a private insurance system that functions as a gatekeeper, exist at other choke points most people rarely think about. The Strait of Malacca, through which the majority of China's oil imports pass. The Taiwan Strait, carrying trillions of dollars in trade every year, sitting one incident away from the same insurance logic taking hold. The Turkish Straits, the route Black Sea grain exports have depended on for decades. None of them needs a full-scale war to become the next Hormuz. They only need enough uncertainty that an underwriter somewhere decides the risk can no longer be modeled. A single verified attack, a single redrawn map from an insurance committee most people have never heard of, and a route that carried a fifth of the world's trade the day before can carry almost none of it the day after. So the honest answer to what happens now isn't a date on a calendar when the strait reopens. It's a slower, quieter process, incident-free weeks accumulating one at a time, insurers recalculating in private, tanker owners deciding voyage by voyage whether the numbers finally make sense again, governments deciding how much longer they're willing to backstop a market that won't backstop itself. The world spent months watching for missiles and mines, when the more decisive weapon turned out to be a spreadsheet. The real question isn't whether Hormuz reopens. It's how many other choke points, holding up how much of the world's trade, are one bad week away from the same quiet shutdown, closed not by force, but by the simple refusal of anyone, anywhere, to put a number on the risk.